Welcome, everybody. The Christian Marauder here. I have a very special guest here. He's been here before, Dr. Judd Burton. Welcome, Judd.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to see you back here. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Judd Burton is a historian, anthropologist, and speaker and author of over 18 books like Nephilim Dossier, Religion of the Ancient City of Pan, Interview with the Giants, a whole bunch of other books like Witchcraft and the Book of the Gray, and taught in several colleges in Texas for over 20 years. He's the director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology right now, currently involved in several other works on the way right now. So what I was thinking tonight, Judd, is to kind of do this kind of an open type free flow exchange of ideas here, because there's so much stuff going on in the world that I don't even know where to begin, because things are getting really out of hand, and the occult world is getting far more blatant in its works, its use of words. We hear it in advertising. We even hear it in churches and church music. We even hear the symbols that are being used, and it is becoming very prevalent. So I just kind of opened this up here today. For those of you who don't kind of keep up on this stuff, there's a new thing that happened this past December. It was the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, which was the Age of Aquarius, according to some of their lore, began. And the Age of Aquarius is a time marked by excelling communication and to make it simple, a Christ consciousness in the whole humanity, to teach humanity to become into this Alice Bailey world of oneness. That's the only way I can put it. And so that's what we're seeing right now. And then I was looking, and we can just take off here, is we see that in Facebook's meta. You know, they have that meta symbol, the infinity symbol, or the sideways 8, which when I did my research, I kept coming back to the affinity symbol attached to the Satan's cross, which involves an age of communication. No matter where I sliced or diced it, I kept coming back to the Age of Aquarius, where the world elites want to take us. They are very bold about it. Now they want to do the metaverse world where they put these 3D goggles on and you live in the Matrix, I guess. Well, let's just jump off. And what do you see about all that?
Well, you know, we call it the New World Order, but it's not really new, is it? It's Babel, you know, it's pre-Babel, you know, Luciferian cultural engineering basically is what they, you know, what they want to bring back, you know, under the new Nimrod, you know, Nimrod being a sort of, you know, predecessor or at least an archetype for the Antichrist, because there was that sense of, you know, it's probably more accurate to say, just looking at it in terms of historical linguistics, particularly if you're looking at Proto-Indo-European languages, that at that time, you know, people in that part of the world really did speak one language. You know, they spoke mutually intelligible dialects of the same Proto-Indo-European mother tongue, from what I can tell. And those of us who are familiar with the Genesis narrative know that that was disrupted because it was ease of communication. Whereas that language functioned for that unity at the time, we have things like the internet. You know, we're using ones and zeros now to basically create that same kind of pre-Tower of Babel oneness. You know, I can't look at world events on my news ticker without sort of plugging it back into the biblical machine, if you will. I think if we don't do that, we end up being pharisaical in a way, because, you know, Jesus, you know, they're like the annoying students, you know, that were heckling you with not necessarily relevant questions, but Jesus always made relevant teaching points through all their heckling, and you know, he chides them for, he's like, look, you guys can tell me when it's going to rain, but you're completely blind to what's going on around you. You can't read the signs of the times. You can read the signs of the weather, but you can't read the signs of the times. And I think that should give us pause, you know, to not just logically pay more attention and critically think about what's going on in our world, but to prayerfully think about those kinds of things for discernment. even if we are living in prophetic times, and I think that we are, I think if you look at things at the end of the day, if you're a serious student of the Bible, I think you at least have to say that we're in a kind of time of Jacob's trouble. I think that that's a pretty sound place to plant your prophetic flag in these particular days. Now, the thing that I'm encouraged about with biblical prophecy is that in a lot of current events is that the precedent in all manner of biblical prophecy is that God always allows the potential for a respite. Mm-hmm. Not that he doesn't completely fulfill the prophecy, but he does always allow an outlet for the cessation of suffering and hardship. But it's predicated on a return to God and a repentance, really a social or national repentance, if you will, and then there's a period of restoration. And I think that that's applicable. If it's applicable to every aspect of biblical prophecy everywhere else in the Bible, then I think that it's safe to say that it's applicable for end times prophecy too, because it's a challenge to even build a chronology. It's such a debated thing, and we're not necessarily called to build a detailed chronology, but like Jesus chiding the Pharisees, we are supposed to be aware of the times that we're in. And those have all kinds of ramifications for not only our awareness and our interaction with people, our walk, but our testimony and our ministry to other peoples, our not just our fellow brothers and sisters in the church, but our fellow human beings as well. So this is yes, it's a difficult time. I'm looking at this as a historian as well. And there are events that are transpiring, things that are taking hold that historically don't bode well for the longevity of civilizations. And we seem to be checking off, some of those things in record time these days. And I think, having been involved in education from K-12 all the way through higher education, for over 20 years, I've watched the history curriculum just become postmodernized, just eroded from any sort of objective perspective on history. I used to tell my students, you have to take the good, the bad, and the ugly with history, the triumph and tragedy, the virtue and the vice, or else you don't get a holistic perspective. But now it's all about politicizing the narrative. It's about weaponizing the narrative for propagandized political means. It's really, really quite nefarious. And I think if we had stayed with a curriculum that was still rooted in classical pedagogy, more people would be aware of these kinds of markers that indicate whether a civilization is going to do well or not, with regard to every cultural institution that they have, whether that's economics, politics, religion, you name it. We're looking at a rather dire situation, but as I say, it's also an opportunity. So I'm cautious and hopeful at the same time in the times that we find ourselves in.
I'm looking at the same thing. I'm a student of history. I've been a student of history almost all my life. And so I see all the patterns and stuff. And God always gives a respite. He always does a call of repentance. So I look at the book of Revelation, chapter 2 and 3, about the 7 churches. He's doing that last call. I call it the last call in that time period. And we don't know if we're actually there yet, but all indicators that we are very close. If we don't turn it around and take this respite serious, and with the renewal at the end of the tunnel, I don't see how we can't proceed toward the tribulation period. And where I see a lot of this is coming into is a lot of different people are redefining the respite period to fit their narrative of what it means and stuff. And so you have one group saying this, another group saying that. And we're, one group is saying, yeah, it's a respite. We're going to take over the government, the what do you call it? The Seven Mountain Mandate people coming in. And then you have another group of people saying, no, it's all going to be signs and wonders. Well, I did some digging in there, and I figured that, Matthew chapter 25, which is an extension of Matthew chapter 24. There really should be just one long chapter, in my opinion. But it goes in there, talks about the parable of the bridesmaids, or the 10 virgins, 5 wise, 5 foolish. In the verses there, I think, I don't know if it's verse 9 or whatever, it says that there was a call that goes out at midnight, go out to meet the bridegroom. And so evidently there's some call that goes out, and it kind of gives you a warning. And the wise had their oil and their lamps and their reservoir, and they were ready to go. And the foolish said, we don't have any oil, you give it to us. And the wise were wise enough to know that they have to go back to the buyers and sellers, and their buyers and sellers been giving them a raw deal. So you go back to them. And so they went out on the dark road. I think the church in that renewal period will ask to be going out in a very dark period. And I always find it interesting, and maybe you can enlighten us a little bit more, but when I study the world of the occult, the third watch of the night, which would probably correlate, just for simplicity's sake, would be 12 midnight to 3 a.m., which is the witching hour, when they do most of their spell casting. So I thought that was an interesting correlation that Jesus applied there, especially was prevalent in the ancient world with Moloch and all the ancient rites they practice, and now modern witchcraft that goes out. Can't remember the crowd. I know it was Aleister Crowley's crowd in England that gathered around and did their witching hour to curse the Nazis or something. And as just an example of that, they do a lot of spell casting at that hour. And then Jesus says at midnight, and that would be the third watch, in the darkest of dark, when the occult world is gaining its ascendancy, it's almost reaching its point to bring forth the new Nimrod. And they use they're going to use Nimrod's breath, just one whiff, and we're all going to die. So you're going to have to take this magic potion. And it's not very effective, like any magic potion, so you got to keep taking more magic potion. And and we're going to use this Nimrod's breath in order to bring forth Nimrod. And I mean, we can't even say some things now without being censored. And so that's kind of what I see. Yeah. And people are seeing it. And it kind of goes back to the idea, we're getting back to the world of the Nephilim. They were all in one language. And in the Age of Aquarius is talking about going back to that new golden dawn, where we come back to the new Age of Aquarius of communication, where you actually brainwash. I mean, I should not brainwash, initiate. Cult form of initiation through words. And so we have wokeism, we have all this going on, and people don't know how to answer it because this is occultic. Do you have any insights on that, or just take off on there?
Yeah, language is culture. Words are culture. They're the shorthand of a culture's ideation. The nuances and interchangeability, the very livelihood of words in the languages of the world demonstrate history and value and tradition and just every imaginable component of the human societies of the world. And of course, the Bible repeatedly tells us how important that words are. God spoke creation into being. So right from the beginning, we have the biggest precedent of how powerful words are. And that continues on through, the actual process of the revelation of the scriptures. The psalmists and the proverb writers both allude to repeatedly, albeit in lyrical and poetic fashion, but they allude to the power of life and death being in the tongue, and the words they're uplifting, and they can also tear down, and they're healing, and they're also weapons. And so, I mean, it's not hyperbolic to say that words are everything, just in terms of culture. and their impact. And I firmly believe that we're looking at a kind of widespread witchcraft, or to use the New Testament Greek term, pharmakeia, that's being used now, and it's ensconced in words and the manipulation of words. And for those in your audience who are familiar with George Orwell in 1984, I think he does a really good job of illustrating how propagandists and draconian regimes utilize language, either building it up or, in the case of 1984, tearing it down for their own purposes, to try and control large groups of people. And although he's doing it, Orwell in his mind is not talking about witchcraft. That we're talking about really two sides of the same coin, the obverse and the reverse. And when you consider that so much ritual is rooted in the formulaic delivery of words, in terms of that's a perennial in the occult, basically, whatever tradition you're talking about, whether it's kitchen witchery or druidism or thaumaturgy or whatever, or Kabbalah or whatever. You're going to find that use of words. The converse element to all that, and of course the more powerful element in usage of words for believers, comes in the form of prayer, but also the authoritative use of Scripture. And so it can't be overstated, I think, how important language is to understanding not only what's happened just in terms of the history of languages and how languages were split in the Bible and why they were split. It wasn't natural linguistics. It wasn't something that you don't see in the natural course of the splitting of language, but it was something that God initiated because people were easily controlled by the first world order, the empire under Nimrod, which is, well, we said, off camera, I said that there's really no new world order. It's really the old world order that was established even before Nimrod comes on the scene. Earlier this year, I wrote a paper called "The War of the Words" that looks at the one particular way that the Watchers and the pre-flood and early post-flood giants manipulated human culture. And for those in the audience who have read apocryphal material and know about the sons of God and the giants in the biblical narrative, it's pretty clear that they were cultural engineers, that they changed the trajectory of human cultural history and manipulated a lot of institutions for their own ends. And the idea, the concept that I zeroed in on in this paper was the concept of a king or ruler being related to a string of words from the Proto-Semitic and Ancient Semitic worlds: Rephaim, Rapha-Umi from the Ugaritic material, and Rabba and Apsu from the Mesopotamian material. And I wanted to see, because it was so close to the Transcaucasus region, which was the homeland of the aforementioned Proto-Indo-European language family, I wanted to see how many languages in Europe and Asia may have been impacted by this wording, this shared cognate, and how many words for king or ruler might occur with that initial R vowel morpheme at the beginning of that first syllable. And I found dozens, close to 80, just in the cursory example of these words that start with this initial R vowel sound. Everything from like Rex in Latin for king, and Rajan in Sanskrit, and Rey in Spanish, and Roy in French, and Gri in the Gaelic tongue, or Celtic tongues like Gaelic, and Manx. Just all over the Eurasian continent, you would find variations on this theme. Now, a handful of those would be interesting, but the numbers that I began to wade into started to become very compelling, that there might be this connection, and could very well be a demonstrable connection between the influence of the Watchers and the Giants in the early period, the pre-flood and the early post-flood period, on developing this one concept. And just like the demonic does, it takes what God presents and turns it on its head. It makes a shadowy, dark reflection, an opposite of that. And so God, who was Yahweh, who was the good, just, virtuous King of everything, the Lord of Lords, that's a political scenario there. There's a political culture in heaven, and we're seeing it's a monarchy, but it's the ideal monarchy. It goes far beyond the forms of ideal forms that Plato talked about in all his rigmarole. And so the Watchers and the Giants take this and turn it on its head. Instead of the good, just, patient, kind king, the rulers of these city-states become autocratic despots out for their own gain over everything else. And in the history of civilizations in the world, this theocratic monarchy, this absolutist tyrannical form of rule, has been the rule and not the exception in human politics. And so you can kind of see how nefarious this is just by the manipulation of one idea crystallized in a word and then diffused over time and space through language all over all these cultures. That's 3D level chess.
Yeah, and the church world is largely ignorant of that. And what I see out of this type of warfare, I discovered in the Sumerians' king list of all places the use of Chaldean numerology with its word definitions that form a language. This language actually conjures ideas which we are seeing coming to bear fruit right now, all related to the days of Noah that Jesus warned about. What I found is the pre-flood king's reigns are mega thousands and thousands of years old. Like one is 36,000 years old, for example. What I found is that if you add up and reduce each of the sums, they all equal the number 9. And 9 is very significant in the occult world, about balance and harmony and getting back to this new world order, or this old world order they want, where everybody speaks the same language. What I'm kind of piecing together is they perverted the language and used it as a conjuring, let's just say initiation into a new mindset, brainwashing. I don't know what else to say. And that's primarily what a lot of conjuring rites are. They initiate through words, and these words take root in your brain. For example, the woke culture. You can't have a sense of humor now. Humor is dead, and you can't make fun of anything. And I watched a clip from John Cleese being interviewed by a woke reporter. He got sidelined or ambushed by this person, and he marvelously knocked her totally out of the ballpark in about 4 minutes. And I thought it was brilliant. But it's like, I mean, you're talking about what about the people's feelings you're hurting? You're playing on words to get to some place that doesn't exist, nor is it capable of existing without, basically, I don't know what else to say. It's almost like they're gunning for the collective suicide of humanity.
Yeah.
That's the only way I can put it.
Well, sure. I mean, and the only reason that it can, I mean, logically, if somebody set this proposition in front of you, and said, okay, we're going to do X, Y, and Z to American language and culture, and this is what we want to accomplish with it, and it's all bad. It's like, we want to take away subtlety and nuance and clarity, and all of that out of language, basically so we can A, control you, and B, cull the herd, because that's what we like to do. We like to steal, kill, and destroy. You would say, that's absurd. There's no way that I'm accepting this proposition. No way. But I think the way that it makes sense, once you've been, manipulated by this sort of word magic, is the cognitive dissonance that's epiphenomenal of it. now we're back to Hegelian dialectics, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Hegel, who was a student of Hermeticism himself.
Yeah. Alchemy and all that.
Right. So, and again, alluding to Orwell illustrates this brilliantly in 1984. They called it doublethink within that particular world. Yeah, and that's how it makes sense, is because you develop unconsciously the ability to hold one thought in your mind while simultaneously, subconsciously holding the exact opposite thought. And sometimes that breaks out in the activity of some of these groups. Like I think Antifa is probably the worst about it, because they decry everything that they really are. They say that they're anti-fascist, but they're
the fascists.
They're the fascists. They're very modus operandi. They're very activity. The way that they carry out their things, it's like you're reading Mussolini's playbook or something. And that's what I'm talking about. There are a lot of people, a lot of policymakers and bureaucrats and politicians within the left-leaning factions of our government who are the same way. I mean, they're on both sides of the aisle. Let's face it. Whether you're talking about liberals or neoconservatives, whatever political paintbrush they paint themselves with, you see this bleed out in the political arena as well. And it's quite disturbing because of the impact that it has on our society and the populace in general, because it all goes back to how powerful words are and what they represent. I started the answer to your question with, words are everything. They contain culture, they contain history, they contain nuance, behavior. They're the sea upon which our ideas and ideation rest on. And so if you can control the language, which is what advertisement, ad agencies have done in conjunction with, arms of the government for decades. If you can control language, you can control the popular culture arc. You can control large groups of people without them thinking that they're even under control.
That's true. I mean, Alice Bailey she channeled that very concept. Yep. Externalization of the hierarchy. I keep going back to that, and was Seven Rays, whatever. But she was talking about you kind of take over all the spheres of influence. She called it TV, radio, media, arts, entertainment, military, governments. You influence with these ideas in order to initiate people to basically those words conjuring in their mind. So you have a new mindset. It's really frightening. I mean, Notre Dame, for example, burned down, and now they're turning it into, or rebuilding it back to a woke theme park. And then I'm sitting there, I'm going, wow. And then you have the Abrahamia going on in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates. They're building a synagogue, a church called St. Francis, and they have a mosque there. And it's this interfaith movement, and it's all about saving the planet. And in the middle of that is a square. They're all shaped square cubes, and the way they're patterned, it's right now in a triangle. Interesting. And in the middle is it's like an underground facility, the education center, or the pupil of the eye. And it is, I'm sitting there looking at the picture of what they're building, and as well as the artist rendition of it. And they're doing it. It's like, even, Pope is doing it. It's like, what in the world? I mean,
yeah, I was about to say, I mean, Pope Francis has been redefining, what Catholicism is in specifically, but he's trying to redefine what all of Christendom is in general. And did you ever think that you would see a Pope who would say that, well, if you don't take the, or whatever we're calling it now, you might actually not be a Christian, or if you don't monitor your carbon footprint, that's not a very godly thing to do. What?
Yeah.
And let's just set aside the fact that, he's the thoroughly Second Vatican Council devotee. He's got a trail of blood behind him in South America. He's a member of the Jesuits, whose order specifically forbids them from holding high pontifical office.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, there are definitely some strange things afoot in the Catholic Church, and I'm actually kind of encouraged because there are a lot of Roman Catholics that I talk to that are seeing through it and looking at it and saying, wait a minute. So I think that there's a kind of awakening that's taking place in the Roman Catholic Church today, which I think we should all be prayerful about too.
We sure need to be prayerful and hope the Roman Catholics get in and see the light, because a lot of them they're the hardest people to reach. I mean, they are. But if they wake up and realize that the Pope ain't all that, he's kind of gone off the deep end. A lot of them are seeing it. I hear it from a lot of my Catholic friends. I have quite a few of them, and they're seeing it. They're shaking their head. And they can't believe it. And what's this guy doing?
Yeah, well, I heard just a couple of weeks ago, the actor Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus in the Passion of the Christ, he gave a speech in which he openly criticized the Pope. He's a Roman Catholic himself, in which he openly criticized a lot of the mandates and policies that were coming out of the Vatican. I thought, wow, Jim's a pretty prominent guy, and I in my heart, I think he's the real deal. I think he really is. And so when you see, high profile, Roman Catholics talking in open forum about that encourages me as well. But it's a strange papacy. I mean, just looking at it, and just in terms of history of religion, it's a strange papacy.
Yeah, I know. I got a few of them pointed this out to me. He says, I got a picture of someone, and they said, "What do you think of this?" And there's the Pope Francis, and there's this Aztec, the Mother Earth goddess sitting there. And they put all the Mother Earth goddesses in the Vatican, and all these statues. And then you talk about saving the planet and Earth, and it's like, oof. And so a lot of the Catholic friends I know, they send me this stuff, and what do you think of that? I'm glad you've seen it. Glad you pointed it out to me, because I would not have even known if you would not give me the photograph. Thank you so very much. I'm thanking them for exposing what is going on in this place.
Well, there are some. I think for a lot of, not to veer too far off subject, because this is relevant too. I think the Second Vatican Council back in the '60s shook things up to the point, because basically that infused the Roman Catholic hierarchy with all kinds of socialistic value. That's basically what it was, is Catholic Marxism. And it threw out all of the old classical paradigms, all the classical Christian paradigms. And so one thing I noticed is that there were a few autonomous Catholic denominations that splintered off as a result of that, or at least increase their distance from the papacy because of that. I know that one of them was the autocephalic Catholic Church in Western Europe. They completely severed all ties with the papacy. They have their own, they have their own administrative church government, but they don't report. They don't have any fealty with Rome, essentially.
And all this ecumenical stuff, all this goes back to we're actually seeing the formation of a one world religion.
Yeah, absolutely.
All the ideas, communication, about these great swelling words of emptiness, going out there about unity, brotherhood of man, all these occult slogans going out there from from the apostate church, from the Vatican, and from the liberal Muslim world, as well as Hindus and all these other people coming on board with this stuff. And it sounds so great, sounds so good, and yet they got a dagger behind their back. And if you don't toe the mark or toe the line, basically it's curtains for you. You don't fit in, you're going to be ostracized, you're going to be put out, you're going to be put down, and everything. And anyway, I got this book back in 1994. It's called When Nations Die. Don't know if you read that one, by Jim Nelson Black. And I reviewing it again, and I'm going, wow, what he wrote in there is what we're seeing now. And it's kind of amazing. And one is, I think it's chapter on decline of education. He writes on page 80 about censorship in schools. And the object is to accuse and vilify Christians and other conservatives of troublemakers in the eyes of the community. But these troublemakers are decent people like you and me, you know. We see that with the DOJ attacking parents and you know, for wanting an education and everything. And then on page 35 here, he writes this in the book: big government, the media, educators, and university and law school professors have an agenda that is oblivious to the wishes of the American people. Tradition standards no longer seem to apply in that arena, since these people are convinced that their task is to discredit the past and to redesign the future according to their own idealistic beliefs. And then he goes on to talk about this attack against the religious right, and traditional values must be silenced. The silent majority suits them fine. Silence allows proponents of change to wage their own covert war on the mainstream culture and change it. I mean, this guy, I read that. I this book here right there. Yeah. And I put it up there on screen. I put a screenshot up there for people. And when I got that in 1994, I borrowed some of that when I was doing a jail ministry, preaching some of the stuff in the jail. And I thought it was bad back then, but I never thought I'd see it to the degree and level that it is now, and the sophistication of it. And it is a blatant war on the Judaic-Christian system in order to, well, lack for better words, build it back better.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's unfolding in real time, and it's, you know, for people that are just starting to wake up to it, it's you're just trying to catch your breath because there's so much that's happening right now. You know, for me, from my perspective, I suppose the close-up view that I had, the closest view that I had to be able to kind of quantify this was from my perspective as a teacher and a professor. You know, just watching the education system combust from the inside, you know, and then realizing that it was by design, you know, that it wasn't just that it's bad enough that that American education has sort of become a laboratory for testing the latest educational theory, which annoyed me to no end. But those experiments were part of the changing of curricula, the shifting of emphases in curricula to accomplish what we're watching right now. And, you know, we graduate more and more students from both high schools and colleges who cannot think critically, who can't write, who can't do basic math. And it's all, you know, it's all been by design to do that. When you look at, you know, how far the United States has fallen just in terms of how we compete educationally with a lot of other nations. Well, it's not just that they're, you know, those other systems, many of which still rest on classical pedagogy. It's not just that they're novel, they're clearly superior. And the techniques that have been gradually introduced and values behind them in American education from K-12 all the way through higher education have gutted the educational process for the most part.
And training everybody to live in that metaverse world.
Right, because you won't need to, I mean, it'll all be passive, right? You're just, you're just, you're a recipient of this virtual reality, you know, basically that they want us to be living in.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, I kind of like these old shows. I like the movie The Matrix, you know,
Sure.
the guy in the pod. And you have what was really fascinating was one of my favorite sci-fi things. The sci-fi always kind of points to the future was the newer series, the 2000 year edition of the new Battlestar Galactica.
Uh-huh.
And they had the Cylons, and they would sit in their pod and regenerate. And then they had a TV show after it that kind of flopped because they just started dragging out the plot line a little too long. But it was the history of how the Cylons came into being, and it came into being by a meta world computer game. And they would put their selves, I'm not kidding, the idea was you put yourself in this metaverse world with this metaverse character, and those characters became the Cylons. And then you had the final 12, who were the epitome of the new humanity. This is so occultic. It's unbelievable, the philosophy behind it. You know, the final 12, you have the top 7, you know, the 7 who decree, and all, you know, all these roles of ancient pagan gods and stuff. You have, let's see, number 6 would be, she would be Ishtar, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how some of these authors were able to prognosticate and comment on, you know, I think about, although I think it has its faults, the new Dune adaptation, you know, Frank Herbert's novel Dune. I've always been a huge fan of the book series, and the backstory to that is that thousands of years before the events that transpire in the movie, in the book, humanity just becomes so completely apathetic that they have technology and machines and artificial intelligence doing everything for them. And so they're not learning anything. They're just sort of passive recipients. They're jaded and hedonistic. And what ends up happening? Well, the small groups of technocrats that own these corporations that created the thinking machines, is what Herbert called them, but artificial intelligence and robots, they use all of that to enslave humanity. And by this point in time, humanity had sort of, you know, started to settle in other systems outside of the Terran system. But, you know, I mean, we're looking at that process happening right now. I'm like, how in the world do people like Orwell and Herbert and H.G. Wells and Huxley and Ray Bradbury and all these guys, how do they, you know, how do they divine this stuff? You've got this connective tissue, these themes that are running all through it. And anyway, it's one of the conversations I wish people were having about that movie right now, but nobody seems to want to talk about that. But
well, I think there is some sort of influence from the beyond, is what I'm thinking is.
Clearly,
because it's all guiding in the same direction, almost the same plan. And I like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. They had Soma. Now we have Metaverse.
Right. Or fill in the blank, you know, with what, I mean, there's so many you know, take your Soma and go back into your trance.
Yeah. And, you know, you'd be a good, what was it? You have A class, B class, C class, you know, be little purple people or whatever, you know, the little worker bees, everybody's happy.
Right.
And and, you know, and one thing that really struck me with George Orwell and all these guys, even Battlestar Galactica, they have to have an enemy. There's always an enemy. And so in Orwell's book, they had imaginary enemy, and they blew up their own cities to justify, get people in fear of something in order to maintain their control. I watched a movie, and it was called 1944. It's about the Estonians and World War II. So this NKVD chief, the Soviet Union, was in charge there, the political officer, and the Estonians caught some Germans who just kids, you know, 16, 15-year-olds trying to escape and go back home. And he ordered this guy to shoot him. He says, "You must fear the Soviet Union. I'm teaching you to fear the Soviet Union, fear the communism." And so one of the guys in the crew shot the guy and got rid of him. But I'm telling you, that's they have to have an enemy to fight. And so what I did some research on, and I'm still writing and trying to get it all put together here is that the world's elites, they have a playbook. You can download load their playbooks all over the place. And one of the things they say is they have to make an enemy. So they make the enemy of Christians and all that's decent and good, and they have to build it back better. And they're like Mr. Black said in the Nations Die book is, you are going to go to war against the American people and get rid of the, what did Alice Bailey say, the reactionary forces, get rid of them or convert them. If you don't, you get rid of them. But you always have to have this enemy to fight, because that makes people easily controllable. If it's an imaginary enemy or whatever. So in the metaverse world that I was looking at and doing some research, you can basically, it's not fully developed yet by a long shot, but basically the idea is, a lot of it in the Matrix is that you can play. And so you can get your anger and aggression out without hurting anybody.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, these sort of proxy enemies are created. You could argue that the current situation we're in right now is one of those. We've created the pandemic, as it's referred to in some circles. We've created this obfuscatedly defined enemy, out of this, what's clearly a manufactured, or at least an altered. And that, I mean, that's got fear and panic written all over it. But we've done that with terrorism. We've done it with drugs. We've done, these proxy enemies. You're right. They make it easy to direct the focus of large groups of people and sort of get them on board, by the means we've been talking about today on the program. These occult magic means, using language. And I think that there have been stages, not just in the world, but in the United States too. There have been stages that have sort of experimented with our populace, just to see how far that they could push it, and they did it with things like terrorism and with drugs, and now they're using a. But what happens when the shift becomes, and I think this is a transition that we're starting to see too, and back to your point, what happens when the shift takes place from these proxy enemies to real people? And there are, like naming, right-wingers and Christians as terrorists, Well, now it's not a proxy enemy. Now it's not a, made up sort of thing. It's actually something that directed intentions and orders can be handed down to go after, which is again, there's a precedent for this in virtually every tyrannical regime that's existed on the planet.
And add to that, the one other thing that Daniel mentions in Daniel chapter 12 is he talked about there'll be knowledge increasing and people running to and fro. So I just did a little Hebrew digging and research. There's different ways to interpret there. I think it's just an open-ended type of interpretation. And knowledge, basic knowledge and education stuff will, people get smarter. I look at the world, they're getting dumber, but that's I digress with that. But when you look at it, running to and fro expresses being frantic. And if you throw too much data, and you mentioned this earlier, too much data at somebody at all at once, you can't handle it. You need a respite. You need a rest. You need a break. And that's a form of brainwashing, is to overwhelm your senses with knowledge and data. That's what that is saying. And so you run frantic and you're easily controllable. So at the time of the end, people will be so much data thrown at them to look for a rest. They can't find it. They get frantic. And then the totalitarians take over and they put you in your metaverse cage. And so you can rest. You find peace and safety. And I mean, the Bible is just coming very much alive right now.
Yeah.
It really is. When I read it and I was going, wow, we're seeing so much of this, and all these people are actually open about it now. And it's so easy to find out of their own documentation, their own words. And the World Economic Forum is a hotbed of that stuff. And
yeah, they don't hide it. I mean, you
mm,
can, like you say, you can download their white papers.
I
You
have.
can, yeah,
I use it for my
yeah. I
research.
know you have. That's what I'm saying. I mean, anybody can go on the internet and download these things and, you know, read them for themselves. And that's what irritates me about when people call this conspiracy theory. You know, I'm thinking about this as a, you know, as a scholar.
Hmm.
I'm like, wait a minute.
Yes.
You know, with some variation, this is the same general sort of training that I got in all of the historiography seminars I had. What do we do as historians? We follow the documents.
Yes.
They're out there, you know, and taken together, they make compelling arguments. It's not, you know, it's, there's another example of vilification, you know,
Hmm.
creating enemies is, you know, it's easy to write things off by saying that, well, so and so is a conspiracy theorist or whatever. But that also all goes back to how we have completely jettisoned basic logic, basic philosophical logic.
Yes.
You know, it's like the old axiom from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle when Sherlock Holmes says, I'm paraphrasing here, but yeah, basically, when you finished your investigation, if you've eliminated the impossible, whatever you're left with, however improbable it seems, must be the truth.
Yes. Yes. And I mean, I guess it's because I was a student of history. I've been that way all my life. You know, I was born with a partial cleft palate. You know, I had to overcome
Hmm.
a lot of stuff, and then I was, you know, put behind a year because of that. And then in elementary school, my fifth and sixth grade teacher, well, she's the same teacher, but she said she didn't know how to get me to learn anything, so she got me a book or scholastic reader on history. I fell in
Uh-huh.
love with it.
Sure.
And then I loved the research, and so I learn about stuff from, I mean, Bullwinkle cartoons. It was, you know, Simon and the dog and the time machine, and so I go to the library, and I'd be reading philosophy books to find out who is Plato, who is Aristotle, and
Hmm.
so, and then when I was in going to elementary school and junior high and high school, we were educated to think critically,
Sure.
and all of a sudden, you know, in college, you know, I went back much later. I was trying to get back in the late night or early 1980s is when I tried to
Hmm.
go back, but I decided to, you know, go into business for myself at that time, which
Sure.
I did. But I went back later after I got married in the 90s, and the whole educational system shifted to I was, I was battling Marxism.
Yeah.
And I would actually go in there and I would to a Marxist professor in sociology telling me that the benefits of Keynesian economics and collectivism. And so I just said, well, um, you know, just I asked him, what does Marxism offer anybody? He said, they offers ideas. I said, ideas can't feed you.
Yeah.
He laughed. You know, he I only got bad grade from one Marxist professor because I stated that there was a definite difference between male and female.
Uh-huh.
And I got canned for that and
Yeah.
worked real hard for a C.
But it's this, and these are the same, you know, ilk of people who are telling us to follow the science today, and yet they there's that same sort of gender flexibility that they hold to, which has no scientific basis whatsoever. But whatever, you know.
Yeah, whatever. And I look at all this stuff and yeah, and they want to paint everything as conspiracy theory, but some conspiracies are true, you know, people.
Certainly.
And all through, I did this research, and I can find it in the halls of Congress from the 40s all the way up to close to the current date, where people were warning about the stuff. Some of the people died
Hmm.
mysteriously, and so forth, etc. And then you read David Rockefeller and
Hmm.
open about the New World Order, and there and Papa Bush and George Bush all open
Yeah.
about this stuff, and it's like, oh my, I mean, you have the yin and
You,
yang fighting each
yeah.
other, you know, they're
Your, yeah, and
controlled
your
opposition.
initial, at least my initial response was just complete, you know, revulsion. Like, you know, you wanted to like throw up,
Yeah.
uh, you know, because I consider myself a patriot. I love this country. I do. But, you get a kind of rose-colored, glossy version of how things are, growing up, and then to have your bubble burst, not just because of what's happened in our own country, but you learn about the fallen state of man and how susceptible we are to corruption and sin and vice and things like that. And certainly these things have happened in civilizations and societies throughout, human history. That moment of revelation is kind of jarring, and, well, it's like, to use another allusion to a movie, it's like the Matrix. It's when they pull Neo out of his little, his
cocoon.
Amniotic cradle where he was,
Yeah.
powering the machines or whatever.
Mhm.
It was a jolt to the system, but the truth has it also has a freeing power all of its own.
I think that's what Jesus meant. The truth, and the truth will make
And
you
the
free.
truth will set you free. That's
And
exactly
Jesus
right.
is the truth, the way, and the light. So
That's right.
he helps you see this stuff and puts it together.
Well, and I think that's why a lot of the church fathers in developing Christian education married their ideas to the classics, because they saw, I think it was Clement that said that there were some members of his church asking, well, what is, these pagans have all this philosophy, and what good does that, does that do us in the end? And I can't remember exactly what he says. Something like gold in the pocket of a thief is still gold. In other words, there are things that are articulated in the scriptures by Jesus and the disciples and everybody else in the scriptures, that are thematically echoed in the philosophies of other cultures. And I think that's why, like even to this day, homeschoolers and Christian academies, use that trivium system that people like the early church and Alcuin and Charlemagne's court put together, because it married Christian values with that system of education that worked and has worked for centuries, and we've completely done away with that.
Yeah, we have.
No.
To initiate people.
To initiate people. That's right.
Oh.
Because you don't want thinking people if you want large groups of people to side with you for some nefarious purpose and not have any moral compunction about it. You don't want to be teaching them to think critically.
No, not at all. Nope, not at all. But I was looking at one other thing, and you talked about history, and so I want to go back. And one thing I learned about history is to look at it with a critical eye. And there's no perfect country. There's no perfect tribe. There's no, it doesn't matter. Everybody has the same sin, and they do the same things: oppress people, take their land and property. But what I find nefarious is from all the way back from, I would say, when Cain slew Abel on up to current date, is it seemed like there was a class of people that was always behind the scene. They were, I call them, the great men and merchants of the earth, for lack for a better term. And they would help control the government, and they would be in cahoots with each other. They would make the government rich, and they would scratch each other's back. And so in all these groups of people, just make a long story short, would intermingle and marry each other, but then they would fight each other to get natural resources from an unconquerable land, and then they put their people in place, and so you have this perpetual war mode going on. And,
yes.
And then you go to this part that I'm getting to, through vast amounts of ancient history to modern history, where you have the kings and the bloodlines and all that. And all these people were fighting their uncles and aunts and cousins, and then they got tired of it, and they came up with the League of Nations, making a long story short, that let's get rid of war. This is the liberal world order I'm talking about, the liberal world order. And so we can figure out how to conquer the world. And so, and all that stuff. So when I go back and investigate the documents, and the best example, there's two examples, and I'm going to use one, is the Boxer Rebellion in China.
Yeah.
They had all
1900.
All these robber baron types financed Christian missionaries to go into China. I mean, it's just a matter of public record. And they did. And I looking at that, I go, there's something, they use Christians as a shield to go exploit while they exploit the land. The Christians got blamed for exploiting the land and enslaving people. And the robber barons got away with bloody murder.
Right.
And it's like, I'm going this, and so the native people would rebel, not so much against the Christians, but they were the only ones they could go after. And then these robber barons are so bloodthirsty, ruthless, is that they use the murder of the Christians to justify sending their armies in there to crush the rebellion in order to take more land. They did it in the Philippines. In the Spanish-American War, they did it to the First Nations people. I mean, it's incredible.
It's why we, for the Pacific at that time, it's why we created the open door policy. It was an open door, all right.
And send the Christians first to win the public population, so they get hurt and murdered, and support them, finance them, and then use them as a shield that you can hide behind so you don't get caught.
And ultimately, it's the people like the Christian missionaries, and it was the people like the Chinese that belonged to like the Iho Chuan, all the martial societies, and just the people in China in general that ended up suffering because of it. It's just bloodshed and human sacrifice.
Yeah. And it was, when I kept finding, it's almost like you said, human sacrifice. It seemed like that was the purpose. I couldn't put my John Hancock on that, but it seemed like this was like a bloodiest. It was like a bloodlust in these people in order to assuage their worship of whatever they were worshiping. And I find out that most of them are involved in the occult world anyway. So it makes sense to me now.
That was part of. I think that was part of the tragedy, because the Iho Chuan were basically gung fu practitioners of one sort or another, and they held to a kind of mystical belief that their cause was so just that the bullets of this coalition force that included, this is before the League of Nations even, but it included Americans, it included the British. There were other European nations that sent forces as well. But these poor guys literally thought that the bullets would just bounce off of them, while they did their kung fu. Well, that's not how it happened. And it was on both sides, it really was kind of a human sacrifice.
Yeah, it was.
And what did it do but perpetuate the drug trade? And at the end of the day, it's these robber barons, that are making money hand over fist over the whole thing. But that's what they, war has always been a way for them to generate money anyway. That's why we've been in an ever war, since the beginning of the last century.
And that very narrative about the bullets bouncing off people were found in the Lakota tribe, and led up to Wounded Knee as well.
Yes, the ghost dance movement.
Yeah, so you have that mindset that predates the Boxer Rebellion that we were talking about.
Yeah,
and it's almost like something we know what it is, principalities and powers of darkness that are manipulating this, giving these people these ideas, and they're all consistent. They're very consistent. And this thing about, getting the bulletproof or arrow proof goes all the way back, just sort of a cyclic thing at certain points in history. And it always led to brutal massacre of lots of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a historical invariant.
And it's just, like, I do not know why that a lot of seminaries now do not want to teach spiritual warfare, or that Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12 is even real. And yet you have the evidence of this all over the place in history. It is so, it's there. Yeah,
clearly. You and I both know that those are epiphenomenal conditions based on materialism and naturalism, seeping into modernism, affecting our seminaries and colleges. But that's another guise that the enemy has cleverly used in the modern age, is this, this camouflage of science, which sounds scientific, but it's really not science at the end of the day. But it's under this cloak of naturalism that this occult agenda is executed and carried out.
It is, and boy, and then I could go in. We have to do another show, I guess, and talk about the occult
yeah, let's
influence,
do it.
The invasion of the educational system, or invasion of the seminaries, as I call it, because it is an invasion, and they put several moves into the seminaries. One is a hyper intellectualism, where everything is taken, the supernatural is removed, in order to produce a rebellion within the church to go with the signs and wonders. It's the occult signs and wonders, not the real deal, but the occult version.
Right.
In order to bring the church into a universal, ecumenical, one world religion. So, yeah, we have to come back and do that, but we probably should wrap it up right now and get people prepared for the next show. If you're interested, we can set something up and do that.
Sure.
And everything. So, yeah, before we close here, is there any things that you're doing now that you like to tell people about? I'll also put your contact information on screen here.
Sure.
When we end, but how to contact you, as well as any new books or ideas or papers you have out that people, and also how to get in contact with you, and also about everything that you do.
Sure. Well, on that note, in terms of picking up the slack, where the old academic machines have sort of dropped the ball. That's part of the reason that I got out of academia. God called me out in the first place was to create a different kind of scholarly community. And so through the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, I teach classes that emphasize the supernatural element of the biblical narrative. And I try and keep them at a reasonable rate, easily absorbable kind of stuff. Still reading heavy, you still get the academic rigor, but this is to equip people for the age. And so I've got several certification programs. I pick up new students every week, and I've got a deal this week where students can sign on for $105 for the 12-course program, and they also get 5 ebook copies of my original 5 of my original works. And so if people are interested, they can contact me. The sale may end by the time you air this, but if they just send me an email, telling me that they heard it on your show, I'll be happy to give them the sale price when they do that. And I've got a couple of book projects in the works. One is a commentary on John's letters, finishing up a paper with Doug Van Dorn on the Serpent Mound of Bashan, which is another kind of interesting thing. We could probably do a whole show on that too. Wow. But there's lots of moving parts, lots going on. And if people are interested in any of that, they can contact me at professorburton@yahoo.com.
I just suggest that if you're listening, please check that out, and maybe take some of these classes and courses and stuff, and get yourself a real education. Really, I mean, the more I involved in the Bible, and the more I study history, the correlation of the biblical narrative is in history is playing out. I'm amazed at the wisdom of God and how He can put all these connections together and bring and work through all this and come out on top at the end. It just it's amazing. He wins.
Right.
Right.
And we have the window into that plan. We have the scriptures. It plugs that narrative into the larger context of world history. Absolutely.
Yeah, and then that day, and He comes back riding on that white horse. It's going to be a glorious day.
Absolutely.
Amen. Well, I'm so glad you came on today. We'll try to set up another time, and we can do some other of these things that we just talked about, because I think the listeners would like to hear this. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off now, and everybody be blessed in Jesus' name. Any last comments, Dr. Burton?
Just farewell and Godspeed.
Amen. With that, be sure to check out Dr. Burton's website seen on the screen. And with that, folks, just know that censorship is real. because there will come a time when the censorship will get so hard that you'll have to go to websites like Josh Peck's or other sites in order to get content like this. Okay, so just consider becoming a member of the day. Also, look at your screen and you'll see my contact information. If you'd like to help me out and support me, all my contact information is on there, as well as my book title as well. You can help support me by my book. You can help support me by PayPal account and stuff that is on that screen right now before your eyes. With that, I want to ask you all to be blessed in Jesus' name. Amen.